I went home and I cried because of the noise and the dust. I couldn't breathe. My hair was all white. I tried brushing it off. I had it on my eyelashes. I had it in my eyes and on my clothes. I could not get the asbestos off even with the wet paper towels as I tried to do it. And I really felt like I could not go back another day. But I had to work. I had to support a son. And it was very hard. My mother says to me, well, you have to do it, and which I did. For 28 years, I was there. And it wasn't easy.
Asbestos is a fiber of stone, and it was called the magic mineral because it has some remarkable properties. First of all, it is the only mineral fiber that can be woven like cotton or wool or flax. Each of its strands has the tensile strength of a piano wire, yet it can withstand the fiercest heat known to man. It cannot be destroyed by fire. It can withstand the action of almost any chemical or climate or temperature change, and it is indestructible, therefore, in nature. And because it is indestructible, it also, when it gets into the lungs, can wreak tremendous havoc.
Why is asbestos dangerous? Dangerous in the sense of why does it cause disease? We don't know. Partly it's because it's so very fine, so very small, that when it's inhaled, it goes into the deep recesses of the lung, is taken up by the cells, goes into the lung cells, and there it causes reactions. It causes basically two kinds of reactions. First, it can cause scarring, and secondly, again for reasons that we don't understand, it gets these cells sometimes to become cancerous. It's dangerous in another way. Because of its very small size, it can travel pretty much through the body. It travels out to the surface of the lung, the pleura. It can travel to the spleen, to the kidney, to the liver, to the brain. It can be swallowed. Then it goes into the gut, to the esophagus, the colon, the stomach. And in some of these tissues, not all, but in some of these tissues, again, cancer will appear.
It is virtually impossible to calculate the number of people who have died as a result of asbestos disease. Pliny the Elder in Strabo wrote about asbestos disease at the time of Christ when they noted that there was a disease of the lungs in slaves whose occupation it was to weave asbestos into cloth. 1900 years later, in 1898, Henry Ward Johns, one of the founders of Johns Manville, died of asbestos lung disease. In this century, undoubtedly, in this country, tens upon tens of thousands of asbestos workers have died of asbestos disease. Today, there are 140,000 victims who have filed lawsuits against Manville and other asbestos companies. Dr. Irving Selikoff, the director of the Mount Sinai, or former director of the Mount Sinai Environmental Sciences Laboratory, has estimated that between 200,000 and 300,000 American men and women will die of asbestos-related lung cancer alone in the next 20-25 years. Now, when you consider the fact that there are today in the United States living some 20 million American men and women who have undergone significant occupational exposure to asbestos, almost 5 million in the wartime shipyards alone, and another 5 million in the, or more in the construction industry, you get some idea of the magnitude, the possible magnitude of the number of people who will develop asbestos disease and die of it, because 75% of all the asbestos insulation workers are now dying of asbestos-related disease, mostly lung cancer. So you can estimate, probably within some reasonable degree of accuracy, that out of the 20 million people who have undergone occupational exposure, about 1 in 10 of them will either develop or die of asbestos-related disease. Now, we're talking 2 million people who will develop it, some form of it. And we are certainly talking hundreds of thousands, maybe as many as 500,000 people who will die of asbestos-related disease.
Well, it's a long story about how asbestos came to be dispersed throughout our environment the way it has, so that it's in schools and even children are exposed to low levels of asbestos from the deteriorating materials that are in the buildings. The story goes way back. Asbestos was commercially exploited starting in the 1870s, and people started dying from it around the turn of the century, and this was being reported in government circles and medical circles, but in the meantime the industry was growing by leaps and bounds, and the workers were generally not being informed about the fact that working with asbestos could kill them. And at the same time, people were dying in their early 30s from lung scarring, massive lung scarring from the asbestos that they had breathed in the job. And so eventually in the 1930s, we found, at least in medical circles, it was reported that asbestos was causing lung cancer as well as this other disease, the lung scarring disease, asbestosis. And then still nothing was being done very much to change the way that the material was being used. The market of asbestos continued rising. Sacks of asbestos were being shipped by the multinational corporations operating out of the United States and Great Britain with no warning labels all these years. The workers were unaware of the hazard. And meanwhile, the evidence accumulated in medical journals about how this stuff was very deadly, about how people with less than a half a year or a year of occupational exposure were later developing fatal disease, and that it was a delayed onset disease, that it was too insidious for the worker to figure out by himself because it didn't happen right away. And it was a situation where, without any regulation by the government, and we didn't have regulation in this country until the 1970s, any federal regulation of general industry, industry was on its honor. And industry did a pretty lousy job for all those years of exposing people to asbestos, the manufacturers of these products, as well as other major industries that knew or should have known that asbestos products were dangerous, while all of our buildings and our factories and our power plants and our schools were being filled with this asbestos material.
In describing what happens to a person who has asbestosis, you have to first think about how the lung functions. And the lungs, if you could take my lungs out of my body right now and unfold them, they would cover a tennis court or a basketball court. So your lungs are a tremendous amount of elastic, folded tissue. And all that tissue does is fill up, billow up, and allow the blood to absorb the oxygen from the tissue, from the air that's inside the tissue. Now, the asbestos fibers act like small little razor blades. As they penetrate into your lungs, they go down to the bottom of the lungs, and there they begin cutting and slashing, stabbing your tender lungs. The lungs' reaction, of course, is to form, just like the rest of your body, to form some scar tissue. But this scar tissue doesn't have the elasticity. The scar tissue doesn't allow the oxygen to be absorbed by the blood. It doesn't allow the waste gases that the blood brings to the lung to be expelled out. So in essence, what you have is, if you've ever had a very tight sweater on, or if you've had pneumonia and been taped up, or if you've had broken ribs and have your ribs taped up, you begin to know what it's like to not to be able to breathe in and fill your lungs up, because there's no room there. The room is filled with scar tissue. And this happens not all at once. It slowly happens, usually about 10 years after you begin to be exposed to asbestos, that the scar tissue is in such great volume that it begins to affect the way you breathe. We're very lucky. Our lungs and our bodies are tremendous, beautiful mechanisms which will absorb a tremendous amount of abuse and still service us. But the abuse of continually breathing asbestos is so overpowering that it even cripples the body. And slowly, this dead section of lung begins to move up and up and up and up. And so there's less volume that you can breathe in, and you begin to pant and breathe like this. And when you're talking to an asbestos victim, you'll notice that eventually they begin to lose their breath, or certainly if you walk upstairs with them, you notice by the end of the stairs, they're going because they only have a few air sacs left to absorb the oxygen with. Now slowly, this scarring or this dead lung tissue begins to reach up towards your throat, and eventually it strangles you and you die. You die of suffocation, but it's a long, slow, painful, torturous suffocation, of which the master torturers of the cruel regimes throughout the world haven't been able to mimic a torture like asbestosis.
Living like today's, like living in hell. I can't brush my teeth. I can't comb my hair. I can't wash myself. My wife has to wash me, dress me. Even when I eat, I can't eat because I run out of oxygen. I gotta wait. Take a couple of bites, and I gotta wait. Yeah. So I feel sorry for people that has asbestos. Well, they don't know what they're gonna have to go through. I hope to God they never have to go through what I'm going. No one ever told me that asbestos was dangerous while working in Johns Manville. I pray to God every night to take my life. To live like this, I don't want to live. And I get up in the morning, I'm disappointed. I'm still here. Another day is suffering. I mean, suffering. You don't know the pain. When you can't breathe.
Richard, would you tell us where you were originally from?
I was born and raised in Manville, New Jersey.
And how old were you when you left home in Manville, New Jersey?
Approximately 18.
Did you go to Manville High School?
Yes, I did.
Did you graduate Manville High School?
Yes, I did.
In what year did you graduate Manville High School?
In 1968.
Did you graduate from a college?
Yes.
What college did you graduate from?
Metropolitan State College in Denver, Colorado.
And what year did you graduate college?
In 1976, I believe.
Richard, what is the present state of your health?
Terrible.
Would you please tell the court and jury what disease you are presently afflicted with?
Mesothelioma.
Do you know what your prognosis is?
Very poor.
The lining of the chest, the pleura, is technically known as the mesothelial lining. In our lingo, this is what the pleura is called. When that becomes malignant, it's sort of natural then that we would call it a mesothelioma. Now that in the past was extremely rare, so rare that some expert pathologists said it just doesn't exist. But about 1960, the early hints of mesothelioma occurring with asbestos began to be very firmly established.
Richard, did you ever work for an employer where you worked with or were exposed to asbestos?
Yes, I did.
What was the name of that employer?
Jones Manville.
Did you work in a factory when you were exposed to asbestos?
Yes.
Where was this factory located?
In Manville, New Jersey.
Where in Manville did you live at the time that you worked in this factory?
Approximately a couple miles from the factory.
Can you tell us the address you resided at the time that you worked at the Manville factory?
231 South 15th Avenue.
Would you please tell the court and jury when you worked in this factory?
In the summers of 1968 and 1969, and then again on through the spring of 1970.
One of the things that's been missing in our public health approach toward the control of asbestos and chemicals generally has been the lack of use of criminal sanctions against people who knowingly, willfully, and recklessly expose the public or their workforce or their consumers or customers to mortal hazards. And this is something that has allowed people who manage, powerful individuals who manage vast industrial enterprises to consider that the cost of human disease they create is something that, number one, is probably not going to be borne by their company, and number two, if it is, to some extent, it'll be borne as a cost of doing business, something they can buy insurance for, or a few percent of their profits that they may ultimately have to give up. But as long as it's viewed in those terms, and as long as it's not viewed by society as a kind of predatory, cannibalistic, vicious human behavior that's got to be stopped, and as long as it's treated as something different from some hoodlum going around shooting people and stabbing people, treated different because the guys who do it are wearing $1,000 suits and do it for profit instead of out of pure malice or lunacy, it's going to go on. And so we really need to think in terms of imposing serious criminal sanctions to prevent the kinds of things that have happened with asbestos from happening again and again by the same sector of society that brought us the asbestos disaster.
The industry, either the asbestos industry or the chemical industry, have always hired doctors, both doctors that work directly for the companies and doctors who have acted as consultants, to fabricate, obfuscate, and lie about the prevalence of asbestos disease, both in workers and in people in the general community. The unfortunate thing about these doctors who conduct these specious studies for industry is that because of the old boy network that exists in the American medical profession, there's no peer review. So they are almost never criticized. And they have been able literally to get away with murder. I know, for example, and wrote in my last book about asbestos disease, Outrageous Misconduct, of at least half a dozen of the nation's leading pathologists, and I'm talking in some cases of very famous doctors, who made tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars each year going around the country testifying for the asbestos industry against sick and dying, disabled and dying asbestos workers. Now, these doctors were sometimes out in, say, Podunk, Idaho, testifying that so-and-so's mesothelioma probably wasn't due to his exposure to asbestos disease, a premise that was utterly absurd and that they wouldn't have dared say in a group of their peers. But no one was looking about what they were testifying. No one was following them. So they were picking up all this money here, there, and elsewhere, and then going right back to the teaching hospital in New York or wherever, and having coffee in the cafeteria with their peers who knew nothing about it. And even when the hospital authorities in New York did find out what some of these men were doing, and I know they did because I took it upon myself to tell some of them, they did nothing about it because the medical profession refuses to criticize its own.
Well, of course, we knew that Johns Manville was considering bankruptcy. So when they went into bankruptcy in 1982, we looked on it in two ways. One, we were happy to see that they finally admitted that they were a bankrupt organization. But we were sad from the standpoint that we knew that they were using this bankruptcy not as a clean confession to what they had done to society and a willingness to give off their resources to a court to have them orderly dispersed to make up a little bit for the tremendous damage that they caused to society. But that wasn't it at all. Their attitude was the bankruptcy is what was going to protect them. And indeed, they went into bankruptcy court to hide from the lawsuits of the asbestos victims. And they found themselves in the bankruptcy court of New York, a judge who would cooperate with their plans in creating this evil trust. And I say evil because it brought out to people the idea that they're actually going to get some compensation. It brought to people, we will take your court rights, but we will give you guaranteed compensation, when it was just a mere shell game. The asbestos victims lost their constitutional rights. The enemies of the asbestos victims, the insurance companies and the asbestos companies, hoarded their monies for years and years and years, and they set up this sham trust, which after 15,000 people went through is bankrupt, and 100,000 people are waiting, and 2,000 a month file.
I had a CAT scan, and the CAT scan showed a mass on my lung, which could have been malignancy, and then it couldn't. So I made the decision then and there that I told my wife, I said, well, I'm going to go in, let them take a biopsy, check me out, find out if it is malignant or if it isn't, to find out what is causing this. So Dr. Sisler and Lewis, they operated on me in 1982. And they come up that I had pulmonary fibrosis due to asbestos. And then I was sent to Dr. Susan Don in 1983. And in 1983, she gave me a thorough examination, and she wrote a letter to Johns Manville that I should have an early retirement due to my condition and the working conditions of the plant, that I shouldn't work there anymore. So the letters were sent out to Johns Manville, and they sent letters back to me, and they turned me down. They told me that they didn't have sufficient enough reason or cause to give me an early retirement because they didn't think my condition was that bad. So I had to stay there, and I said I had to work in the plant. In 1983 is when I really found out how bad it really was. My feelings about the company response, I tell you, I really can't describe them because I thought it was really rotten. I mean, the fact that they knew that what this asbestos would do to you, and then they turn around and they knew I had it, and yet I had to prove it and everything in order to get my retirement. And I was devastated, really.
I do not socialize because it's embarrassing with my coughing. I've lost my family. I've lost most of my friends. The compensation does not compensate sacrificing everything that you've loved. My employment, I loved it. My family, I loved them. And my friends that I've lost.
On May 4th, 1981, my son Ted had an appointment in Paterson, New Jersey with Dr. Susan Dahm. He was given a complete physical examination, and the end result was that my son, at the age of 30, was told that he had asbestosis in the lining of his lung. This again was a great shock to me. Myself, a victim, my wife, a victim. Our 30-year-old son is now a victim who only worked a few days in the plant. And I prayed to God that my other two children that haven't been examined don't have this dreadful illness. They won't go for a physical. They are scared, knowing what happened to me, the father, their mother, and the brother.
One of the things that we're beginning to appreciate, and that everybody is beginning to understand, is that the large amount of asbestos that was used in the last 70 or 80 years is still there. It's a mineral. John Thompson of South Africa once said it has a half-life of infinity. Well, it may, but it's not immortal in the sense that it becomes friable, it can be damaged, vibration could make it friable, and as a result, much of the 30 million tons, which is still there, since it is a mineral, is now becoming sufficiently damaged and friable to enter the air and therefore be available for inhalation.
The national government of Canada has gone on a hard push to sell asbestos all over the world. And they've been marketing it, what they call safe use of asbestos, but mainly they're marketing the use of asbestos. They hold 2-day seminars in places like Egypt and pronounce the country a free fire zone for the continued sale of asbestos based on having held 2 days of industrial hygiene seminars for a couple dozen people. And this is what's going on. So what started out as a commercial lie that asbestos could be safely used has instead now become an official lie with the Canadian government's seal of approval saying, don't worry, you can use our asbestos, it's white asbestos, etc. and in any way, it's not in any way, we shouldn't be international nannies telling the rest of the world how to use things. We shouldn't try and ban asbestos in developing countries. They know well for themselves how to take care of health problems. And then you go to these countries and you see they got things like airborne viruses in countries like India. They've got health threats that are so colossal that the thought of adding asbestos, for which they have almost no public health infrastructure to deal with an occupational and environmental hazard like this, is just grotesque.
The lesson we should learn from the asbestos tragedy is how to prevent another one from happening. But you see the same thing happening all over and over again. New hazards are coming to light today, and they're every bit as pervasive as the asbestos hazard, but we're dealing with them in the old ways. We're allowing industry to deny them. We're allowing the Congress to shilly-shally and not do anything about them. And eventually people will sicken and die, and then they'll go into the courts and they'll be compensated. And then if enough of them sicken and die, and it becomes too expensive, then the companies that are responsible can file for bankruptcy. And the whole cycle begins all over again. I've just described you a vicious circle, which is the basis of how the private enterprise system as presently constituted in the United States deals with major occupational and environmental health problems, and only the public can change this. The public, through political pressure, anger, outrage, and information, can make it known to the politicians that it will no longer tolerate this kind of situation where it and its children are endangered.
Well, Manville is the city's name. John's Manville products have brought it fame. The girls are pretty and friendly too. Asbestos City, we salute you. The people came from everywhere, from Pennsylvania and Delaware, from New York City, Chicago too, Asbestos City, hello to you. You've heard my story about our town, so why not stop in to look around? In central Jersey, not far away, come visit Manville, you'll want to stay. Come visit Manville, you'll want to stay.